The first time Lena showed up at my door, she was holding a set of IKEA instructions and looking at me like I was the last person on earth she wanted to ask for help. My name is Brendan Kessler. I'm a structural engineer, 36 years old, live alone in a 2-bedroom apartment in Denver that I've been meaning to decorate for the past 2 years. The second bedroom has a desk, a printer I never use, and a chair I bought off Facebook Marketplace because I told myself I'd start reading more. I have not started reading more. I'm telling you this because the kind of man I am matters to this story. I'm not bad at much. I can look at a load diagram and tell you in 30 seconds where a building will fail. I can read stress points, tension lines, the invisible forces that hold things together or pull them apart. I'm very good at that. I am not good at people. Lena moved into 4C about 8 months before any of this happened. I know that because I was coming back from a site visit the day the movers were in the hallway, and I had to squeeze past a bookshelf to get to my door. She apologized from somewhere behind the shelf. I said it was fine. That was the entirety of our first conversation. The IKEA thing happened, maybe 3 weeks later. I opened the door, and she was standing there in paint-stained overalls and reading glasses pushed up on her head, holding a stapled packet of instructions that had been partially destroyed, probably by frustration. She said she was trying to put together a bed frame and the packet was missing a page, and she'd looked at 5 different YouTube tutorials, and none of them matched her model. And she was sorry to bother me, but she'd knocked on 2 other doors and nobody answered. I said I could take a look. I fixed the bed frame in about 40 minutes. It was a simple cantilever issue. She'd been trying to attach the slats before securing the side rails, which meant nothing was going to hold no matter how many tutorials she watched. I explained this. She nodded and handed me a can of sparkling water from her fridge, which was otherwise completely empty except for a block of cream cheese and some leftover Thai food. I thought about that empty fridge on the drive to work the next morning, not in a significant way, just noticed it, the way you notice things. Her name was Lena Vasquez. She was a public defender, which I found out because I asked what brought her to Denver and she said, the PD's office, public defender. I transferred from Chicago. She said it like she was used to having to clarify. I found out later that people at parties sometimes heard public defender and immediately started telling her about a parking ticket they'd once gotten. She was 32. She kept strange hours. I know because our building has thin walls and I could occasionally hear her leaving early, 5:30, sometimes 6, and coming home late, sometimes after 9, sometimes the sound of keys in the lock waking me up at 11. She knocked again in October. She'd locked herself out and her super wasn't picking up. She wanted to know if she could sit in my apartment while she waited for the emergency locksmith. Because the hallway was cold and she'd just come home from a long shift. She sat on my couch for 45 minutes. I was making dinner, nothing impressive, just pasta, and she asked if she could put something on TV and I said sure. She put on a documentary about bridges. I don't know if she did that because she thought I'd like it, or because she genuinely wanted to watch a documentary about bridges at 10:15 on a Thursday night. I never asked. The locksmith, she thanked me and left. I thought about asking her if she'd eaten. I didn't. There's a coffee shop 2 blocks from our building. I went there every Saturday morning, same table by the window, same order, black coffee, the everything bagel with veggie cream cheese, sometimes a second coffee if I was planning to work. I'd been doing this for about a year. In November, I looked up from my laptop, and Lena was standing at the counter ordering. She didn't see me immediately. I watched her for a second, not in a strange way, just that moment where you recognize someone out of context and your brain is still catching up. She was wearing a heavy green coat and had her hair down, which I'd never seen before. At work, she always had it pulled back. She turned with her cup and saw me. She waved. I nodded toward the empty chair across from me, which I immediately regretted because it was a weird thing to do, too forward without being forward enough, and I didn't know what I meant by it. She sat down anyway. We talked for almost 2 hours. I found out she grew up in Tucson, that she'd wanted to be a marine biologist until junior year of high school, that she had a younger sister in Portland she talked to twice a week, that she'd moved to Denver, specifically because Chicago winters were starting to feel like a personal attack. She found out I grew up in Ohio, that I'd almost gone to law school before switching to engineering, that I'd lived in my apartment for 4 years and still hadn't hung anything on the walls. She looked at me when I said that, not in a mean way, just like she was filing it away. Walking back to the building, she said, "Same time next Saturday." I said sure. We had coffee 6 Saturdays in a row. It became a thing, and I understood that it was a thing, and I did not do anything about the fact that it was a thing. This is the part of the story where I have to be honest about myself, which is not always comfortable. I knew what was happening in the same way I know when a structure is under stress. Not by looking directly at it, but by reading everything around it. The way she'd started leaving a pause after she said something. Just a half-second longer than normal conversation requires. The way she'd turned her coffee cup in circles when I was talking, which I'd noticed meant she was paying close attention. The way she'd once said, completely out of nowhere, "You're easy to talk to, you know." I don't say that to a lot of people, and then looked briefly embarrassed like she'd said more than she meant to. I knew. I am not an idiot. I was also freshly, and when I say freshly I mean 14 months, which is not that long, out of a 5-year relationship that had ended because, according to Mara, I had a fundamental inability to be emotionally available. She did not say this cruelly. She said it the way someone says a diagnosis, tired and a little relieved to finally have the word for it. We'd been good together on paper. I'd thought we were good together in practice. Finding out I was wrong about that had made me careful in a way I wasn't sure how to undo, so I kept going to coffee, and I kept not saying anything. In December she knocked on my door on a Tuesday night. This was outside our usual pattern, and I noticed that immediately. She was holding a casserole dish covered in foil, and she said she'd made too much lasagna and did I want some. I said yes. She handed it to me. Then she said, "Do you want me to come in or?" and gestured vaguely. I said come in. She stayed for 3 hours. We had lasagna and watched half a movie she'd seen before and I hadn't, and she kept explaining things that I actually already understood because the movie wasn't that complicated, and somewhere around the 90-minute mark, I realized she wasn't explaining the movie. She was just talking to me, finding reasons to talk. When she left, she stood in the doorway for a second and said, "I'm glad I moved into this building." I said I was glad too. She went back to her apartment. I stood in my kitchen for 10 minutes telling myself I was imagining things, knowing I wasn't. January was quiet. She was in trial. A big one, she mentioned once, multiple defendants, the kind of case that ate your life for a while. I'd hear her leaving before 6 and not coming back until late. We texted sometimes. She'd send me something she found funny, or occasionally ask me to hold a package if she was expecting a delivery. Normal neighbor things. I missed the Saturdays more than I would have predicted. The trial ended in mid-February. She knocked on my door the evening after the verdict, a Saturday not our coffee time, and said, "We won. I need to celebrate, and I don't know who else to call." I said I'd get my coat. We walked to a bar about 4 blocks away, the kind of place with wood paneling and good beer and no pretense. She talked for 2 hours about the case. Not the details she couldn't share, but the shape of it, the exhaustion and the doubt, and the moment in the courtroom when she understood how it would go. She was a different person talking about her work. More alive somehow, less careful. At one point she looked at me across the table and said, "You actually listen," I said. "I'm not doing anything special." She said, "You'd be surprised." On the walk back she was quiet, which was unusual for her. Not uncomfortable quiet, thinking quiet. When we got to our floor and stopped at her door, she turned and said, "Thank you, Brendan." "Really?" I said it was nothing. She looked at me for a moment. It wasn't nothing. She went inside. I went to my apartment. I sat on my couch in the dark for a while and thought about nothing in particular, which is what I do when I'm thinking about something very specific. March, more Saturdays, the coffee shop, same table, same order. She'd started ordering the same bagel as me, which I noticed but didn't say anything about. One Saturday a guy from her office came in while we were there. His name was Theo, and he was tall and easy in the way some people are easy, the way they fill a room without trying. He'd stopped at our table, said he was glad she was surviving the Hendricks appeal, made her laugh twice in about 90 seconds. He looked at me the way people look at someone they're trying to place. She introduced me as my neighbor Brendan. Theo said, "Nice to meet you," and left. I watched her watch him walk to the counter. It was a brief look. I can't tell you exactly what was in it, but it did something to me that I can't fully explain. Not jealousy exactly, more like standing at the edge of something and suddenly understanding how high up you are. She turned back to me and we kept talking, and I pretended I hadn't seen anything, which is a thing I'm practiced at. The conversation about timing happened in April, on the walk back from the coffee shop. It came out of nowhere, the way certain conversations do. One minute we were talking about her sister's new apartment in Portland, and then she got quiet, and then she said, "Can I ask you something kind of out of left field?" I said, sure. She said, do you believe in timing? Like that things can be right but the timing is off, and that just derails it? I thought about it. I said I believed timing was real, but I wasn't sure I believed it was the main thing. That sometimes timing is the reason and sometimes it's the excuse. She looked at me sideways. That's a very engineer answer, I said. I get that a lot. She didn't laugh. She said, I think I've used timing as an excuse before, for things I should have just done. I said, what kind of things? She looked at me for 1 second too long. Then she said, jury's still out, and turned toward the building entrance. I held the door for her. She didn't look at me again until we were at her floor. May, my firm took on a new project, a mixed-use development in the Rhino district, the kind of project that's interesting and also brutal on your schedule. I was pulling long days, sometimes bringing work home, sometimes eating dinner at my desk. I didn't make coffee 2 Saturdays in a row because I was in the office or on a site. She texted the second Saturday, you okay, you've gone dark. I said work had been heavy. She said, let me know if you want company. I make a legitimate grilled cheese. I said I would. I didn't because I was being careful. I was always being careful. The thing that finally happened wasn't dramatic. There was no big moment, no declaration under rain, no speech. It was a Wednesday evening in early June, and I was coming in from a long site visit, still in my work clothes when I ran into her in the lobby. She was coming back from what I assumed was court because she was still in her suit, dark navy, the one she wore when she said a case mattered, and she had a grocery bag in one hand and her briefcase in the other. She'd clearly had a day. I could tell by the way she was carrying herself, that specific way she went quiet when something had been hard. We got in the elevator together. I asked how she was. She said, honestly, it's been a week and it's only Wednesday. I said I understood that. She shifted the grocery bag. It was clearly heavy. I took it from her without asking, and she let me without protesting. On our floor, we stopped at her door first. She unlocked it and then turned and took the bag back from me, and we were standing very close in the way that elevator doors and apartment hallways make you stand close to people. She said, thank you. I said, sure. Then she said, do you want to just eat dinner together? I was going to make something. I said, what were you going to make? She said, honestly, I don't know yet. Something briefly. I said, yeah. Okay, she smiled. Not a big smile, the quiet kind. Go change. Come back in 20 minutes. I went to my apartment and stood in the middle of the room for about a full minute. I changed my clothes. I washed my face. I looked at myself in the mirror for longer than I normally would, and I said out loud to nobody, don't do this wrong. Dinner was pasta again. This time something she'd made from scratch. A quick vodka sauce that was better than it had any right to be for a weeknight thrown together meal. We sat at her kitchen table, which was smaller than mine, and had a stack of legal files. At one end she'd pushed aside to make room. She'd put music on low, something I didn't recognize but liked. We ate and talked the way we always talked, easy and unhurried, and I kept thinking, this is the thing I've been not doing for 8 months. This ordinary thing, this pasta. After dinner she poured us each a glass of wine and we moved to the couch. She sat close, not dramatically close, but the way people sit when they're not thinking about the distance. She was telling me about a case from her first year in Chicago, something that had gone badly and how it had changed the way she thought about her work. And she stopped in the middle of a sentence and said, you know what's funny? I said, what? She said, I tell you things I don't tell most people, and you never make me feel weird about it. I said I was glad. She looked at her wine glass. She said, I've been thinking about this a lot lately, about what it means when you trust someone. I said, what does it mean? She looked up. I think it means you keep showing up, even when it would be easier not to. There was a pause. I was aware of it. She was aware of it. The kind of pause that's asking you a question. I said, Lena. She said, yeah. I said, I need to say something, and I'm aware that I am approximately 8 months late on it, so I'm just going to say it. She put down her wine glass. She turned to face me more fully. She didn't say anything. I said I've wanted to be here specifically like this, for a long time, and I kept not doing anything about it because I was being careful, which for the record was stupid. She was quiet for a long moment, then she said very quietly, yes it was, and then she laughed. Not a big laugh, just a breath of one. And I laughed too a little, because it was true and it was also somehow a relief to have said it, and have it be true and have her know it was true. She leaned her head against my shoulder. I put my arm around her. We sat like that for a while without saying anything, and outside the window the Denver skyline was doing what it does in June, that particular purple going to dark that always seems like a promise. She said, "For the record, I knocked on your door with those IKEA instructions on purpose." I said, "I know." She lifted her head and looked at me. "You knew?" I said, "I suspected." She stared at me for a second. "And you still took 8 months." I said, "I told you. I was being careful." She shook her head slowly. She was still smiling. "Brendan Kessler," she said, "I have been so patient with you." I said, "I know. I'm sorry." She said, "You can make it up to me." And that is the story of how I learned that all the structural analysis in the world won't tell you the one thing that actually matters, which is that some things will hold and some things won't. And the only way to know which is to stop calculating and put your weight on it.